Putin has trapped himself in an insoluble dilemma. The regime is currently being devoured from within by an economic and social monster of its own creation. The names of these two monsters are the migrant crisis and the paramilitary radical group hunting them down. Putin needs both to continue the war. But now, Putin's dilemma is dragging Moscow's streets into chaos, civil war, and anarchy. Now, this is going to be a controversial topic, and I don't care if YouTube doesn't promote it. I'm going to expose the truth anyways. Controversial topics like this one end up getting suppressed by the algorithm, except when you force the algorithm to promote it by clicking on the like button. Thank you. Now, look very closely at the images you see on the screen. This is Lyubertsy, Moscow Oblast, a masked, military camouflaged, organized group. Approximately 140 people. These are not Russia's official police. They are not law enforcement. They are an ultra-nationalist, ultra-radical paramilitary group calling themselves the Russian community. Russkaya Obshchina. So what are they doing on the streets of Moscow? They are patrolling. According to their claims, they are hunting down immigrant crimes and illegal immigrants. Now, let's look at the sad reality of Putin's Russia in the fall of 2025, with these news headlines appearing on the screen. On October 25th, another massive street riot involving more than 80 migrants took place in Moscow's Prokshino district. That day, Putin's showcase was shattered. Reports speak of a horrific street clash involving knives and cutting tools. The images were so horrific that even Russian media had to censor them. Stop and think for a second. Look, this isn't a medieval movie, it's an incident that took place in the capital of Putin's stable Russia. According to reports, 19 people face up to 7 years in prison. This is where state authority is nullified, where the law ends. This was a civil war that erupted in Moscow. So, where was Putin's famous police force while the capital's streets descended into chaos? This is where the second act of the nightmare begins. The police couldn't stop this chaos, because the police were busy with another civil war of their own. A lawless vacuum formed on the streets of Moscow. This shows that the most fundamental promise Putin made to them 20 years ago, namely the promise of security and stability, the promise to end the chaos of the 1990s, has completely failed. What was said to the Russian people? They were told that the war in Ukraine was a special military operation, that only professionals were fighting, and that it would never affect the lives of ordinary Russians. But now the war has returned to Moscow's suburbs as axe-wielding migrant fights. The war had come home. It is precisely at this point that we encounter Putin's dilemma, the insoluble dilemma he has trapped himself in. On the one hand, he desperately needs these millions of migrant workers. Without them, the war economy cannot survive even a single day. But on the other hand, the presence of these migrants and the social chaos they create is the main fuel feeding ultra-nationalist, fascist paramilitary groups like the Russian community. What does the Russian community say? Look, they say, the police can't protect you. Migrants are swinging axes in the streets. We will maintain order. Do you see? It's a vicious cycle. Putin triggers social chaos with the migrants he brings in to save the economy. On one side, millions of immigrants imported by Putin for his war economy. On the other side, tens of thousands of state-backed radical groups. And on the other side, peaceful but angry Russian youth. This was a self-perpetuating cycle of chaos, showing that Putin had lost control even in Moscow. And the story doesn't end there. On the contrary, it was just beginning. Because the real striking point was the identity of the paramilitary group. Looking at the chain of events, the police were either inadequate, afraid, or did not receive orders to intervene in the migrant anarchy. And as in nature, a vacuum is not tolerated in politics either. Here, it was not why the Russkaya Obshchina group emerged that mattered, but how it was supported. If you think this group is just an outlaw gang, marginalized and isolated from the system, you are sorely mistaken. This was not an ordinary neighborhood watch group. This is Russia's new and most dangerous state-backed paramilitary force. According to Medusa's in-depth investigation, this structure has spread across Russia, becoming a nationwide network of outlaws with an estimated tens of thousands of members. They organize on platforms like Telegram, have cells in dozens of cities, and have one goal: to hunt down migrant crimes and maintain Russian order. So, who do you think is the godfather behind this shadow army of tens of thousands, masked and militarily disciplined? One of the most powerful and feared Silovik figures in the Kremlin, Alexander Bastrykin, chairman of the Russian Investigative Committee. This is a mind-boggling reality. Bastrykin's investigative committee finances, trains, and deploys its own paramilitary force against the official police. A member of the group admitted this openly in an interview with New Lines magazine. "We are helping the police." So, at this point, the famous question comes to mind, doesn't it? Where is Russia's all-seeing eye, the mighty FSB? Rest assured, the FSB has much more important things to do these days. While the streets of their own capital turn into a battlefield between slave laborers and paramilitary gangs, the FSB is busy with real threats. What are these real threats? For example, cleaning up the generals who failed in Ukraine but talk too much, emboldened by Prigozhin's ghost, or suppressing rebellions within the Ministry of Defense, or their favorite game, playing throne games in the Kremlin corridors over which Silovik faction will whisper closer to Putin's ear. It seems the FSB has unleashed this Russian community monster onto the streets as a tool to finish off the MVD, which they see as weak. A clever divide and rule plan, right? But there was one thing they forgot. They became so engrossed in palace intrigues, hunting down generals, and their own internal power struggles, that they completely lost control of the streets. The FSB has effectively handed over the streets of Moscow to the radical gangs they support and to out-of-control migrant groups. Because dealing with the generals' rebellion is much more urgent than dealing with ordinary street anarchy. This is the final destination of the FSB's brilliant strategy. They can't even control the chaos they created in their own capital. The word control is now nothing more than a mocking joke for Moscow. This is the death of Putin's vertical power doctrine. The state no longer has a monopoly on violence. There are now two separate states, and they are fighting each other for the streets of Moscow. If the streets of Moscow are the physical front of the Moscow Civil War, St. Petersburg is the psychological and spiritual front of this war. After the fiery streets of Moscow, we now turn to a busy metro station exit in St. Petersburg. On October 25th, the streets of Nevsky Prospect in St. Petersburg triggered the Putin regime's greatest fear. That day, hundreds of young Russians joined an impromptu concert with a street group called Stop Time. The crowd sang along to the lyrics, standing shoulder to shoulder. However, what made this performance a crime was the repertoire itself. The famous melody from Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake Ballet. This melody was the death announcement music that played non-stop for hours on state television whenever a leader died in the Soviet Union, and most importantly, when tanks were on the streets of Moscow in 1991 and the USSR was collapsing. The police intervention came to shatter this collective memory. Vocalist Diana Loginova, guitarist Alexander Orlov, and drummer Vladislav Leontiev were forcibly taken from their instruments and crammed into a police van amid the stunned stares of the crowd. So, all of this was much more than just a migrant fight. It was an inevitable consequence of Putin's invasion of Ukraine, which triggered his unsolvable dilemma and turned even the streets of Moscow into a battlefield. The special military operation in Ukraine has devastated Russia's demographic structure. Hundreds of thousands of Russian men have either been killed or wounded at the front or have fled the country. Factories emptied, construction halted. Without them, factories stop, ammunition doesn't reach the front lines, and construction in cities ceases. These migrants were the slave laborers of Putin's war machine, its economic lifeline. What was Putin's solution? Putin relied on a single source to replace the hundreds of thousands of soldiers he lost in Ukraine, and to keep the war economy afloat under Western sanctions. Millions of migrant workers from Central Asia, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan. But now that lifeline has turned into a monster, tearing apart Moscow's social fabric from within. Because, to the Kremlin, they were not human beings. They were economic tools, no different from slave labor. They were to be the silent, invisible, expendable, and cheap fuel for the war machine. These millions of people were crammed into massive ghettos outside Moscow. Under inhumane conditions, often without even receiving their wages, subjected to corrupt police violence, they were relegated to the lowest strata of Russian society. And now, those silent, expendable pieces have exploded. So, what do these images, these reports of anarchy, make the ordinary Russian people feel as they watch television at home, trying to send their children to school? Horror, fear, and deep anger. The Russian people are seeing Putin's promise to end the chaos of the 1990s vanish before their eyes. Putin told them he was fighting Nazis in Kiev, but now the Russian people are facing uncontrolled crowds and chaos in their own streets. And this anger is not just fueled by fear, it is also economic anger. The Russian people, already impoverished by the war, have begun to see these migrants as an invading force that is stealing their jobs, lowering their wages, and burdening social services. Seeing that the state cannot control these migrants is destroying Putin's image as a strong leader and turning this anger into racist hatred. The sacred social contract between Putin and the Russian people has been irrevocably torn apart by the images of chaos on the streets of Moscow. The most tragic part of the drama is the reaction of the Russian people. Do you know what ordinary Russians are writing on social media? Finally, true patriots are restoring order. Why doesn't the police work like the Russian community? This is the beginning of the end for Putin. The people are so terrified of the migrant chaos that they are turning not to the state's official police for protection, but to state-backed masked gangs. Consider the morale of an ordinary police officer. A gang financed by another institution of his own state, and indeed by the deep state itself, is taking his job away, and the people are applauding this gang. This is an internal explosion that wipes out the loyalty of thousands of police officers to the Kremlin. Putin created two monsters to protect his own castle: an uncontrolled migrant slave labor class and a paramilitary army of tens of thousands, out of control, to hunt down that class. Now these two monsters are devouring each other on the streets of Moscow, and Putin is just watching, because he needs both of them, one for his economy, the other for his image of hard power. So, what is the international repercussion of all this internal chaos, this image of loss of control? Putin claimed he started the war in Ukraine to establish a new world order against the West. He presented himself, Xi Jinping in Beijing, and the mullahs in Tehran as the leaders of this new order. Now think, Xi Jinping is sitting in his office in Beijing reading these reports. What does he see? What do his allies in Iran see when they look from Tehran to Moscow? A strong, stable, reliable ally that stands up to the West. They see a weak partner who cannot maintain order in his own capital, where mass brawls take place in the streets, who has lost the monopoly on violence to his deep state's paramilitary gangs. A weak partner who has lost control of the streets, even as his all-powerful FSB struggles with general uprisings, and who is humiliated by his own youth with chance of defeat. This is the collapse of Putin's entire international image. Putin's claim to sell security and stability to his allies is over. They see that Putin, who has failed to achieve victory in Ukraine, can no longer even hold his own home, his own capital, together. This situation directly erodes the allies' support for Putin, the credit they have given him, and most importantly, the respect they have for him. Why would China invest more in an unstable, internal, war-torn subordinate ally? Why should Iran trust a protector who cannot ensure its own internal security? Putin's myth of being a strongman has been drowned out by the chaos on the streets of Moscow. Here are the three fronts of the Moscow civil war. Putin's slave laborers created anarchy on the streets of Moscow and drew the wrath of the people. Putin's deep state is so preoccupied with generals and each other that they allowed paramilitary gangs numbering in the tens of thousands to take over the streets against the official police. Putin's future generation is singing the Swan Lake lament to announce the collapse of his regime. These three fronts are not independent of each other. It is a deadly spiral of chaos, interconnected and feeding off each other. The migrant chaos legitimizes the rise of the paramilitaries and secures them popular support. The rise of the paramilitaries leads to more chaos by destroying the official authority of the state. And all this chaos has triggered a psychological uprising by destroying the people's last hope. While Putin tried to conquer Ukraine, he lost his own capital, Moscow. He completely lost control. The vertical power doctrine is now a vortex of chaos. Swan Lake is Putin's lament, and those sounds of turmoil in the streets are the sounds of Putin's regime tearing itself apart. In the end, what goes around comes around. So, what are your thoughts on this matter? Please share your thoughts in the comments. To stay updated on new videos, please subscribe to our channel and don't forget to turn on notifications. Thank you for watching.